Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including the slow leftward lean of the American politique, an interesting article breaking down why the Teamsters loss, the non-endorsement for the Harris campaign, is so crucial and what actually led to it, and then another interesting story about how Intel has lost its place as one of the top chip producers and manufacturers in the world. But of course, we will end today with our daily delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump into our daily debate. So, when you look at the United States as a country, do you see it as a conservative country, a liberal country? Do you see it as a nondescript country with liberal values but not necessarily aligning on any particular political spectrum as a whole? Not just as, individuals, as a whole, not certain segments of the population, as a whole. I would say overall we are probably one of the more conservative nations as a whole, but things are most definitely shifting. And as this first article will point out, it has some arguments about how we are going to the left. And I think it's interesting. I've been breaking this one down for a while, but I want to hear your opinions before we get into all of that. With that said, throw them down in the comments section. Now we're going to jump into the first article from Mises.org, The Gradual Leftward Shift in U.S. Politics and the Economy. So what do I mean and what do they mean? When I say that the United States is slowly shifting towards the left, even that I feel is not necessarily accurate, because just saying the left can mean a lot of things. But if we look at the spectrum from the 1970s, and we'll go back to the 1940s as well, but if we look at the spectrum from the 1970s, early 80s, Social Security, Medicare, they were basically embraced by the Republicans. They realized it was a political topic that they can't necessarily actually repeal, but they were willing to at least acknowledge, hey, we need to address this, we need to make serious changes. And at some points we tried and didn't necessarily go over very well as a country, but at the end of the day, the Republicans were at least willing to message on the fact that these sort of things may not be solvent if we don't address them. Immigration is actually one which was interesting in that the Republicans had a little bit of a more hardline stance. They eased up a tiny bit on it, but they were still not saying that we should open up immigration without any sort of regulation or any sort of oversight, but rather that we need to open up immigration, but we're going to put some restrictions on it versus a more open policy that probably would have been pushed by a little bit more of the left-leaning population. And obviously we're speaking in generalities here. You can find the exceptions to all of these different examples that I am pointing out. Now, if you go back even further, obviously the conservatives were very different. They were not even necessarily libertine. They were actually willing to use the government as a means to reach their ends. And the libertine era of conservatism was really through the 60s, 70s, and really has progressed into the neoliberal era. And now it's starting to shift away. And that is the interesting conversation that is evolving. What is one of Donald Trump's main things that he got criticized on, but he's always willing to back it up? It's saying, and when I say back it up, I mean actually take back the point and say, no, I have a different stance than what they're saying. Remember when Joe Biden said, they want to repeal your Social Security, they want to repeal your Medicare? He was pulling out the old talking points from the 90s, from the early 2000s, which it was true at that point. The Republicans always talked about at least restructuring it, if not getting rid of it, and privatizing it under Bush. But Donald Trump is out there saying, no, wait, we're not going to touch it. That is an obvious shift to the left. The protectionist policies rather than free trade policies, that is an obvious shift towards populism, not necessarily towards the left. But what it actually connotes overall is a willingness to use the government as a tool in order to reach your ends, which in the modern spectrum has been defined, or at least one side has been more willing to do it that way, and it is the left. The left sees the government as a tool in order to get what they want, whether it be giving out certain stimulus to certain segments of the population, giving out certain grants to certain underserved segments of the population. That is what the left sees the government as, an engine to create change and alter the path of the country. And now you're starting to see some conservatives take up that exact same message. And that is interesting in my opinion. And that's why I wanted to really focus on this article from Mises, because Mises is a libertarian organization. They are a little bit more of a conservative libertarian organization compared compared to some of your other sections of the Libertarian Party. And what I mean by that, one of their greatest examples where they differ is they actually believe in having borders in order to secure your country. Some libertarians don't think there should be borders whatsoever. So obviously they're already a little bit more to the right, but the fact that they're calling out the gradual leftward shift is always interesting when you're taking a 30,000-foot view, because some libertarians could probably argue and would be willing to say that we could move more quote-unquote liberal or libertine in some aspects of our culture where conservatives wouldn't necessarily be willing to. So when a libertarian starts calling it out, it's something that you at least have to pay attention to. And I say call out, maybe they don't see it as a bad thing, but at least mentioning it and making sure that's at the front of the people's minds. You have to recognize what is going on here. You can't be ignorant of the different forces that are moving here, and the populist right is one of them, and they are moving a little bit more leftward. So let's actually get into one of the first quotes here. And there, let's be clear, I'm going to move on from the Democratic Party section. I'm going to move on to, actually, it's not moving on completely from the Democratic Party, but it's more of the middle section that I thought was a little bit more impactful. Quote, the collectivization of consciousness. This is what it's labeled. Quote, the Democratic Party under Harris and Tim Walz has increasingly promoted a form of collectivization of consciousness, particularly through education and cultural institutions. This involves shaping social norms and values through government policies and social pressures. So let's pause there. This is exactly what I was talking about. This is the using government as a tool in order to shape society and to get what you want out of it. And actually, there was basically a wholly accepted rule within the Obama administration that they would start using policy in order to nudge people in one way or another. So maybe when you are signing up for a government program, you're automatically enrolled in something else, and that is a nudge because it is a default setting. Maybe there are small little incentives or small little pushes that guide people into one habit or another that can be instituted from the government level, and it doesn't feel as though it is a massive violation of your privacy. It doesn't feel as though it is a massive overreach of government because it is a small suggestion, but it also can slowly shape culture and society. So you see policies like this beyond the Obama era and continuing into the Kamala Harris and Walz campaign. So it's a very interesting topic, and obviously we're focusing on the Democrats right now, but we have to understand what the left is doing before we can move on to any different commentary on what the other half is doing. Quote, thus the Democratic platform strongly supports integrating concepts such as critical race theory and gender studies into the political education system. These teachings, which are often presented as objective and scientific, are viewed by critics as forms of ideological indoctrination that promote a divisive understanding of race and identity. And whether or not you agree that critical race theory needs to be taught or gender studies needs to be taught, I think that we need to always take a step back and say, is this 100% backed up? Now, then again, we do teach how should I put this delicately? We do teach things that are theories rather than 100% fact. They're based on our current understanding of things. But normally, the ones you could think of are maybe people are taught about string theory, even though it's a theory, it's not necessarily a law. The theory of relativity, all these sort of things are still taught, even though they're theories. They're well-founded theories, but they are still theories. But these are in these hard sciences rather than in social sciences, which are, I don't want to say that they are, discredit them and say they are not science whatsoever, because they're trying to use some sort of scientific method in order to reach their conclusions, but also the bias that you yourself bring into a sociological study means that you're actually interpreting some of the information in a way that isn't necessarily biased, but is definitely filtering things through. At least if I'm to accept the sociologist's point of view, which is that every single person is directly and inherently influenced by their society. There are not necessarily underlying characteristics that are strong enough to break through some of these quote-unquote social trainings, then that would even apply to the person that's actually interpreting the information. So if you have a deep hatred for XYZ group or XYZ person, and you have data that's coming out from a study that you've done about said person, maybe your opinion on it will shape it, just like you're saying it's true, that it's shaping everybody else's opinion, or the societal framework has shaped other people's opinion. That's a really, really, and let's be clear, it's actually using their argument against them that some of these things can actually be properly quantified through sociological studies, which I think at the end of the day, it's a solid attempt. I don't actually believe that most of these characteristics that they're trying to whittle down into social constructs actually can be simply whittled down to social constructs, so I don't even agree and accept their point of view. But if I was to accept their point of view, I think their argument actually provides a perfect opportunity in order to actually discredit, or at least cause people to question what they're saying, which is, if social constructs have that much power over us, how do you know that your social constructs and your beliefs and your experiences are not actually shading how you read the information? Then again, if I'm being completely fair to sociology, they would probably acknowledge full well that it actually can and does shape how they view information. It's just one of those things that I don't think is properly fleshed out yet. If anything, I would say it's a new science that's currently developing, and I don't necessarily think their methodology has been 100% proven correct as of yet, especially considering multiple sociologists have come out and have very different theories. Then again, that is the beauty of science, the constant back and forth, the battle between ideas. Because at the end of the day, any form of science is about searching for the truth. And I feel that the left doesn't necessarily nowadays use that same framework when applying some of this information that they talk about and they say is true, but they don't necessarily want to continue to stretch and go further and really dig into some things and understand all of the parts. They want to simply have a narrative so they can use the government as a tool in order to fix the problems. They want to look at the problem, they want to look at the end result, and they want to backwards engineer a fix from there, rather than looking at some of the things that actually led to that problem and fixing them on a cultural level rather than on a governmental level. But they're not the only ones that have shifted a little bit to the left, or at least if you're using, in the framework that we're talking about today, a leftward shift being more willing to use the tools of government in order to achieve your ends. The Republicans are also going that way. Quote, the Republican Party, traditionally considered a bastion of right-wing ideology, has been losing that attribute with each election. In the current election cycle, under Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, it has adopted a platform that embraces populist and economic nationalist policies. These policies, while framed in conservative rhetoric, often incorporate elements that are more affiliated with left-wing principles. So where do they come from on this one? Quote, Trump's economic policies are a mix of left-wing populism and right-wing conventionalism. For example, the Trump campaign supports extending tax cuts. Go over that one. Quote, additionally, the campaign advocates eliminating the income tax on Social Security benefits and the tip tax. These measures align with traditionally right-wing agenda of maintaining low taxes, increasing individual savings, and boosting population's purchasing power and potential for future investment. So, all following in the relatively normal right-wing sphere of economic policy. But what else? Quote, Trump and Vance's focus on America First politics emphasized protecting American workers and industries over global free trade. This economic nationalism, which includes tariffs and other trade barriers, is a departure from the traditional right-wing free market principles and aligns more closely with left-leaning economic populism. These protectionist measures are intended to preserve domestic jobs and industries, reflecting a willingness to intervene in the market to achieve national economic goals, end quote. So you can see, willing to step in, use the tools of government in order to get what they want out of it. You can see how this is a little bit more left-leaning, or at least nowadays you can understand the argument that this is more of a populist push that you would see from the left. So this evolution, this change, is it because, and maybe that's why Donald Trump is so popular, is it actually benefiting the Republican Party? Maybe it is helping them electorally. Does that mean that it is actually the right path for the nation? Some people would argue yes, some people would argue no. I can't pretend to know what is going to be the ultimate solution, what all the problems are, how all the fixes will work out. I can't pretend to do that. Nations have risen and fallen under completely different systems that use completely different perverse methods, whether it be theology, whether it be monarchy, whether it be republic, whether it be a pure democracy. All of these different systems have virtues, and we are trying to battle through just like anybody else. But I can tell you now that the speed with which this change has happened should be something that we are fully acknowledging. I've talked about it for quite some time now. Even Mike Pence, who, let's be clear, not a lot of people like Mike Pence, but he made the famous quote, "Do not fall to the siren song of populism." And while I thought that was a little bit bait and switchy, it was a little bit politician-y, you can see where he was coming from now as the more full vision of a person who is willing to be completely pragmatic in order to get what he wants and concede to all of the points of the other side, or a large amount of the points of the other side, in order to get elected. You can see how this can actually be a momentous shift in how politics are viewed. Because if the part of the population that actually affiliates with Donald Trump and his new wing of the Republican Party stay with the Republican Party going forward, or the Republican Party is relying on them to actually win the elections, then there is going to be a massive shift, because they will no longer pursue those truly conservative, or at least neoconservative, policies of absolute free trade, trying to get rid of Social Security and Medicare in order to bring down the deficit. And don't get me wrong, lots of Republicans still talk about reducing the deficit, but it's just very fascinating when they are willing to keep saying the same things, and yet they're acting totally differently because of the coalition that they have brought in. And they change their words on other things as well, which would seem to go perfectly in tandem with the other policy position that they hold. So watch out. Keep an eye out for this one. And I've been talking about it for a while now in my personal life as well as on the podcast. It is something that we cannot ignore. And if you are a person who grew up with the Ronald Reagan era and you're looking at the Republican Party now saying, "This is not my dad's, this is not my Republican Party," I would not be surprised. Then again, the little bit of populism that was sprinkled in there, that little bit of California Republicanism that shifted the party then too, it maybe some of those Ronald Reagan Republicans are like, I at least remember this energy. Maybe not all the policies, but I remember the energy. And maybe that's what's keeping them, some of them in, even though some of the values are not being properly portrayed by the politicians. So, with values not being properly portrayed, let's go to the Teamsters, who are a union. And guess what? Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, their administration has been very, very pro-union, and yet they did not endorse her. What went wrong here? So we have an article from Slate. The headline reads, "The gigantic failure that led to the Teamsters' decision not to endorse Harris or Trump," which, I'll be honest here, it's not actually that much of a problem for Trump, because he wasn't going to expect the unions to endorse him anyway. It is a bigger problem for Harris. Quote, "But the Teamsters' much publicized decision to not endorse Kamala Harris this week turned that political maxim on its head. The 1.3 million member Teamsters union failed to endorse anyone. Quote, unfortunately, neither major candidate was able to make serious commitments to our union to ensure the interests of working people are always put before big business." End quote. Teamsters President Sean O'Brien said in a statement. That's the end of the quote from the article. So this was kind of a shock. I won't lie. Even when I heard it, I was sitting down and I was saying, whoa, what's going on here? Are they really still bitter about the fact that Joe Biden, even though, and I've heard this cope many times from people who are definitely pro-labor, but they've said multiple times, well, actually in the legislation that governs most of the modern rules around trains and transportation, in the train industry, he actually had the right to make sure that that strike didn't go forward. And I'm sitting there saying, yes, okay, that's fair enough, but that sounds like a heavy cope from somebody who is more pro-labor and would want the union to actually fight for their people. Now, are you going to catch me saying that all unions are amazing? Unions are the best? No, you're never going to catch me saying that, at least not here. Voluntary unions, I'm for the most part, unless there's some sort of extra scheme behind the scenes where people aren't actually able to properly vote in their representatives and it's more of a seniority system. I think at the end of the day, while I understand why those exist, because those people who have been in the union for longer have a better understanding of what the union stood for in the past, and you want to keep some of the tradition around. At the same time, if it's not properly representative of the population of the union, should it actually be representing them at all? It's a complicated question from there, because once at that point you've already accepted the fact that unions have to exist and you're kind of just debating about how they exist. But the point being that unions, they're sitting here, they're like, okay, hey, we've had the NLRB on our side for a long time now. We've had antitrust processes coming in from the Biden DOJ. Mr. Biden is on the side of labor. And yet, The Teamsters is over here saying, but not enough. Not enough for Miss Kamala Harris. And this is not going to be good for her. At the end of the day, if you have one person that is willing to peel off and pressure you and say, I need more from you in order for you to actually get my nomination, I think that this could actually encourage other unions to do the same. Then again, if some of these unions feel as though the concessions that they have gotten during the time of Joe Biden being president and having a stronger national relations board that is more in favor of them, they may be okay with putting up with the fact that they don't get hard promises. But if the Teamsters are willing to hold out and say, no, we need harder promises, it could actually have the inverse effect of what these people are arguing, which is, well, basically they're saying, oh, we don't have to worry about, she's saying, the article's saying, that the Kamala Harris team would not have to worry about the concerns of the Teamsters because they're not actually vying for their endorsement in the future. I think it actually allows a permission structure for other unions to say, look at that. They're willing to withhold their bet. We're not just immediately on the Democrat side. We actually have to make sure that we are telling the candidates what we want and that we're following through when they do not listen to us and they don't give us assurances. So I'm of two minds on it because I do actually believe their argument within Slate does make some sense, which is if the candidate doesn't believe they have to fight for your endorsement anymore or fight to keep you on their side, they may actually throw you to the wind. But I think it could cause a change in how unions go about looking at things, especially as the demographics of the union themselves actually has become more I don't want to say Republican leaning, but at least Trump leaning specifically during this era. So let's go through what the article's saying at another point. Quote, meanwhile, Harris is part of an administration that moved political heaven and earth to enact the Teamsters' #1 legislative priority, a $86 billion bill passed in 2021 that rescues underfunded pensions for over 400,000 Teamster members and 2 million union members in all. Trump opposed that legislation. Many Democratic politicians must be asking, why even bother pursuing policies that the Teamsters wanted if the Teamsters seem to be taking the Democrats and their pro-labor efforts for granted and telling the party to shove it? End quote. And that is their point. That is, at the end of the day, we're not going to pay attention to you if you're not even going to acknowledge that we did something for you. And the Teamsters is over here saying, hey, you did something for us in the past. That is no guarantee of you doing something for us in the future. We need hard commitments from you. And you obviously can't trade. Like, what I mean by that is they can't say, well, we're not going to endorse you unless you do this. Because that could be, well, I guess technically they could do that, but it would be considered something that might be a little bit on the lines. They say, in general, I need you to pursue more pro-train labor policy and ensure that these companies can't bully us around. And then that's general enough that from there they can say, okay, yes, hey, we'll accept that without necessarily giving specific policy proposals that they have to follow. Then again, an endorsement's a little bit different than paying for it. But at the end of the day, the question is always going to arise, is this going to be enough? Is this going to be enough from the Teamsters to jog the political sense of the Democrats that the unions are not inherently on their side? Then again, they basically have been. And the Democrats are definitely going to be more pro-union than the Republicans are. So if nothing changes after this, I wouldn't be surprised. But I think there's an opportunity here for unions actually to leverage things. Like I said, I don't necessarily agree with unions. I do not want all of the port strikes happening and increasing the cost of my goods and increasing the wait time on products. I do not want the trains or the giant trucks, aka most of what the Teamsters does, to be slowed, because then that is higher cost for businesses, which means there's higher costs for me. I do not want those unions to have so much power and do those sort of things, because at the end of the day, I want my products at a lower cost and I want to make sure there's no supply chain interruptions. But I can't sit back here as a political actor, as a pragmatist, and say, this is the moment to push. Where there is mush, push. And I think they could actually exploit this very well if other unions came out and said, see, look at the Teamsters. Actually, we're going to follow here. We're going to come out as a united front against this next administration. Then again, will it actually happen that way? No, it probably will not. But we have to ask the question, should it? And I think it's worthy of asking. So, with that said, we've gone through this one. I want to flesh out another article very quickly, and this one comes from the Wall Street Journal. And this is also talking about all of these things center around economic pressures within the United States. Some are on the populist side. Some we're talking about the labor side. This one is talking about the manufacturing side, which is a little bit labor, but it's also talking about the health of some of our largest companies, and it is Intel. How Intel fell from global chip champion to take over Target, from the Wall Street Journal. So when I first read the headline, my mind went to the fact that the Qualcomms of the world, the Nvidias of the world, even the Apples who actually export the chip making to places like TSMC and Qualcomm, they are actually really growing rapidly. They're getting better at designing more efficient chips. At the end of the day, they're getting better at producing more high-end chips with more transistors, smaller chips that are running more efficiently. And Intel, how many computers do you see with Intels nowadays? They are not necessarily the top end. Whether it be a Ryzen chip, whether it be the new Apple M1 chip, you're starting to see that high-end segment of the population of chips get actually taken off of Intel's infrastructure and going on to other things. Whether, like I said, it be Ryzen, even Nvidia is technically, then again, their CPU chips are different than their GPU chips, but a lot of GPU chips are being transferred over into Nvidia. You're seeing a lot of people rise in the market right now, and Intel's kind of sitting on its boots like, whoa, hey guys, slow down, chill. We used to be top dog here. What is happening? So let's start at the beginning of the article. Quote, 3 years ago, Intel was worth more than double its current value, and Chief Executive Pat Gelsinger, was on the prowl for acquisitions. A recent acquisition approach by Qualcomm, reported by the Wall Street Journal on Friday, reflects a vulnerability with few precedents in Intel's 56-year history. Now, Intel itself is a takeover target, and a sign of how strategic missteps in the artificial intelligence boom, have combined to reshape the fortunes of America's most storied semiconductor company. So, remember the good old days when Intel was basically exporting chips all around the world, when the computer boom was taking place here in America? Now we're looking to places like Asia, whether it be China, whether it be South Korea or Taiwan, and all these other places that are also building up manufacturing. Like, we're seeing a little bit there in Vietnam. I don't know how many fabs, that's what you call a chip producer, I don't know how many fabs they necessarily have, but the infrastructure is most definitely growing there. You also have rapidly improving education standards, improving technology within the region, a population that is becoming more educated and more wealthy, therefore they can afford more things, so you're going to start to have more domestic chip production as well. And you have to take a step back and say, what happened to Intel? They simply fell prey to being the top dog in a very competitive market. They also kind of fell, I don't want to say into a trap, but they were not strategically placed for AI. And that's not necessarily their fault. Who knew that NVIDIA's GPU processors would actually be basically 3 or 5 times more efficient and better for processing information and data analytics for AI programs? Now, Intel couldn't have known that much ahead of time. Maybe they could have seen it coming, but at the end of the day, they had this idea of them being the number one without understanding, or at least putting enough resources into a horizon looking point of view. And what I mean by horizon, they're not looking over the horizons. They're not looking at the new technology. They are trying to strengthen up, whether it be buying different manufacturing companies, whether it be expanding their current business model. They were okay with staying on top where they were. And as the market became more specialized and more, whether it be gaming chips, whether it be normal chips, whether it be AI processing chips, all these separate specialized industries started popping up, and they're starting to realize that they're getting narrowed in. They're getting hemmed in by a whole bunch of different sides. Qualcomm is basically just a smartphone chip manufacturer. So every single part of their different business is starting to be eaten into, because it makes sense. Gaming computers are going to need different chips than your at-home Mac. Your at-home Mac is going to need a different one than your Pro Mac. Your Pro Mac is going to need a different one than the Samsung Galaxy. So Intel was just not diversifying enough into these different specializations. They were sitting pretty on the place they were without even taking advantage of the biggest one, which is AI. So They tried. They very well did. The article goes through multiple times that they tried to do different acquisitions. They tried to strategically pivot. And if you want to read all of that, I would. It's very interesting to do a business study here. But the reason I wanted to bring up this specifically is this is what happens to nations as well. If nations are not ready to pivot, if they're not placed to understand that different specializations come about, the U.S. was very good at making military equipment at one point, and we still are very good at making military equipment. We're very good at putting out scientists. We still are, but other countries are starting to also have great education systems with great minds being filtered through the system and being propped up to the top. And luckily, we have enough innovation in this country where we can stay on the front edge of things, but we always have to acknowledge that there is more to gain and there is more specialization to do as the economy starts to evolve. And we cannot fall prey to the arrogance of being on top. And remembering that we always have to be looking forward, not just upward. Intel was looking upward. How can we just keep growing up, rather than expanding horizontally across different areas and then reaching those places where specialization can occur and grow up from there? The business analogy got a little bit lost there in the middle. So if you don't necessarily stick with it, I think you could actually go read this article and you'll have a better idea of their overall strategy, because it actually is enlightening to read through some of these different perspectives of some of the CEOs and executives that were there and outside people who are observing NVIDIA's fall, or at least their decline. They haven't fallen quite yet, but once they get purchased, they will probably be an overall fall. All right. With that said, let's jump to our daily delight. This one is going to leave a smile on your face. I say this normally, and maybe that's just because that's always what I want the daily delight to do. But I really do think that this one is going to make you have a little bit of maybe a little bit of a hop in your step. Maybe that's it. Because it's not just about cuteness. It's also about a viral thing that you've probably already seen. So here's the headline. Quote, "There's a scientific reason we're obsessed with Mudang, the viral baby hippo." And it comes from the HuffPost. And they describe why we love the baby proportions. We want to defend the babies. We want to make sure on an evolutionary level that they are protected, that the next generation is saved. And when we see those sort of same proportions that we see in human babies that inspire some level of protection and care, when we see those in animals as well, we start to at least identify the similarities. And there's something that is struck within us about, we have to protect this little thing. And if you want to read all about it, you want to hear about this research, or I say research, this very loose research put together about the baby hippo that is driving the world absolutely crazy, and you want to see some cute photos, go read this article. Or if you want to go back to any of the other articles, all of them will be linked in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, as well as the Twitter handle where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. And on this channel and the RSS feed on Tuesday and Thursday, you have 6 and 6, which is 6 stories from around the world in 6 minutes or less. So with all the self-promotion out of the way, thank you for joining. And with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.